One of the first responses I would give is that the economists, or at least some of them, might not see this, but we will have degrowth even if we want it or not. Either the nature will kind of just impose that on us. I don't like that kind of terminology, but we're not that external to nature. But I think economies will have to shrink, and our production and consumption activities will have to shrink sooner or later, because we are approaching critical limits in terms of what nature offers us. But having it as a kind of a severe economic crisis and shrinking versus a managed process, a collectively managed process, differs a lot. Because as we know, out of economic crisis, usually people who are already marginalized and fragile get hit worse, whereas some people actually profit out of economic crises. So if we want to democratically and more equitably and in a socially sustainable way manage this, degrowth kind of as a political strategy is the only thing that we have. The economy is embedded in a biophysical system, which means that it exchanges materials and energy with that biophysical nature. And in so doing, it is actually subjected, although most economists, and I mean, not only kind of conservative economists, but also kind of economists on the right, or like most thinkers would like us to believe, contrary to what they would like us to believe, the economy is also subject to biophysical laws, which means that it is also, for instance, subject to the second law of thermodynamics, which implies that 100% recycling of energy is not going to be possible. So we cannot recycle our way out of this ecological crisis. So 100% efficient technologies will never be possible, because we will always need energy and materials to run those technologies. And the renewable energy solution, for instance, is not going to work forever, because the sources of renewable energy are much less efficient in terms of their energy output than fossil fuels. So if we try to switch our energy consumption to renewables, even if we could, we don't have enough land on this planet to do that. So we will have to shrink. And yes, in a growth-oriented economy, in a growth-oriented capitalism, degrowth or shrinking would mean recession. But by degrowth, I do not mean kind of shrinking in a growth-oriented economy. I mean by degrowth, reorienting our economies to different relationships and to different objectives. So kind of localizing our production and consumption circuits is one degrowth strategy. But it's not only that, it's also producing and consuming for a different reason. For instance, producing for sufficiency and consuming for need, where sufficiency and need, what we define as our needs, are defined not as individual decisions, but defined in more kind of, let's say, democratic venues. Of course, I mean, we're not going to decide, oh, what do we need, what do I need to eat today in a kind of neighborhood council maybe, but making economic decisions localized and more democratic, such as like as a neighborhood or as a community, as a commune, as a housing co-op, we might deliberatively make decisions about what kind of needs we have in that community and like what are we going to demand as like necessary for our survival, which is something that Gibson Graham also talks about. So degrowth will also change how economies are organized. And I mean, part of the premise is that as we change our economies, as we kind of transcend capitalism, kind of tying back to other things that we talked about, growth in itself will stop being as much of a pressing issue as it is right now. Some of the degrowth proposals, for instance, some of the very kind of critical ones propose that we de-link kind of social welfare from employment. So kind of proposals such as the universal basic income, where every citizen is or we can, let's not say citizen, every human being living in a state is entitled to a certain amount of money from the state so that they do not have to work as much in order to meet their needs. So this is a way to kind of fulfilling needs from being employed. And it can be a way to reduce the working hours in the economy as a whole. So one question then would be like, who's going to pay? Like, how will the state pay for this universal basic income? Then comes kind of a more tricky issue. Degrowth cannot happen, or these kinds of proposals cannot happen if we do not redistribute the existing wealth in a more equitable way. So kind of one of the, let's say, kind of foundations of degrowth is rather than producing more, we can actually share what is already there more equitably. And that takes the pressure off economies to grow. Because when we think of growth, it's usually framed as the answer to create employment or to fight with poverty, right? So kind of deconstructing those discourses is important for degrowth. Why do we have poverty? And do we actually need growth in order to address poverty? No. We can look at why poverty is systematically created in this system and change those conditions. We can also have redistributive policies that can address poverty. So I understand and I sympathize with especially kind of Marxists who criticize or who are reluctant to embrace degrowth, saying that degrowth is impossible within capitalism. And it's true to some extent that capitalism has a growth imperative in it. It runs on a financial system that is based on debt, right? And debt and interest, which means that you borrow some money and then you have to pay it with interest, which has this kind of growth imperative built into it. You have to make more money at the end of that period in order to pay the interest. So without changing the institutions of the capitalist economy, I don't think degrowth would work as a transition system. How you change those institutions I think is a matter of kind of contextual strategy. I think building community economies is one part of it, but again, connecting with social movements and demanding institutional change in certain respects is another part of it.